Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar, which is made possible by the generous support of the Miriam Mimi Pasternak Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives. Before we start today's program, I'd like to say a few words about the JDC Archives for those of you who are not that familiar with us. The JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC, since its founding over 100 years ago. Our collections include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as film, audio, and video recordings. Visiting scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, journalists, filmmakers, genealogists, and others use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. One of these fellowships is the Sorrel and Lauren Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established in 2015 thanks to a generous gift from Sorrel and Lauren Chassin, who are with us today and who I would like to thank for their generosity. Sorrel Chassin will, in fact, introduce our speaker today, Dr. Alexandra Jakubczak, who is the recipient of the Sorrel and Lauren Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024. After Sorrel's introduction, Dr. Jakubczak will give a lecture for about 40 to 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted, but that you can send us questions at any time during the lecture and the Q&A via the Q&A function on Zoom. Sorrel Chassin will now introduce Dr. Alexandra Jakubczak.
Alexandra Jakubczak is a historian specializing in the social and economic history of Eastern European Jewry in the modern period. Since 2022, she has been working as the chief historian at the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews. She received her doctoral degree in Jewish history at Columbia University in New York in 2023. Her doctoral dissertation, titled Sex Worker, Migrant Daughter, The Jewish Economics of Sex Work and Mobility from 1870 to 1939, explored how Eastern European Jewish women experienced urbanization, industrialization, and mass migration by examining their involvement in selling and organizing sex. She is currently the Rothschild Hadnadiv Fellow at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism at the Technical University of Berlin, where she is pursuing a new research project about the transformation of Jewish family life in Poland between 1914 and 1945. She is also the recipient of the Sorrel and Lorraine Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. She will now start her lecture.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Sorrel, for this kind introduction and for your support of the JDC. Without you, my research would not be possible, and also this lecture today. I also want to thank Isabel Rohr from the JDC Archives, we just seen a minute ago, who organized this lecture. So as it was already mentioned by Sorrel, this lecture is related to my new research project about Jewish women and Jewish families' experiences between 1914 and 1944. And I titled this lecture, Between Entrepreneurship and Reliance on Welfare, Jewish Women Facing the Great War on the Eastern Home Front. And let me pull out my presentation that I would like to share with you. And as you see at the first slide, it's also very much connected with my previous doctoral research about sex work, though this presentation is not going to be exclusively about this, but that's how actually I started to be interested in Jewish women's experiences during the Great War. Let me start with a story of an individual Jewish woman that will take us straight to the topic. We're in mid-1917, at the height of the Great War, another name for the First World War. And that year, a Jewish widow, Rizla Kamin, sat in her dark apartment that was located in the cellar of Pańska Street in German-occupied Warsaw. She looked at how her 4 small children lie and sat around apathetically. They all were hungry. Since their father and her husband died in early 1916, Rizla tried to sustain her family, but what was available? The factories and workshops stood empty, and many city residents turned to peddling and engaged in an informal economy. Rizla herself began to hawk fruits. However, as the war went on, all the products became scarce, and trading became extremely difficult, with Germans exerting control over trade with licenses and food stamps. That year, Rizla sat with a helper to write her petition to the Jewish Distribution Committee's local branch in Warsaw. She was illiterate, so the assistant helped her draft a petition describing her difficult situation and previous efforts to support her broken family. This is how we get to know her wartime story. Her dramatic letter to the JDC offices in Warsaw ended. Quote, "My poor little ones and I are dying from starvation. To escape death from hunger, I'm compelled to implore your esteemed committee to take pity on me and my poor children and to grant me a monthly relief sum as to enable us to hold out during this critical period." Rizla then signed this petition with her own hand and submitted it to the JDC offices. Her petition was one of many received by the committee that sought to help the thousands of needy Jews residing in war-torn Warsaw. Rizla also belonged to a group of millions of Eastern European Jews who suffered during the Great War. While the Second World War and the Holocaust overshadowed World War I, this war was by all means a catastrophic period for Eastern European Jews, some of whom, maybe even Rizla herself, lived long enough to witness another catastrophic world war over 20 years later. The Great War brought displacement, physical and emotional insecurity, financial ruin to many Jewish families. Organizations such as the JDC played an important role in alleviating the situation of the masses of Jewish women, children, and elderly, who made up the majority of Jewish population who remained in the occupied cities on the Eastern home front. In my lecture today, I will explore how Jewish women like Rizla Kamin experienced the Great War on the Eastern home front, and I will show what made Jewish women's situation particularly difficult and how they navigated this period, from entrepreneurship to reliance on welfare. So until very recently, the Great War has been a rather forgotten event, even in the scholarship. In the last few years, we saw the appearance of 2 books devoted to the Jewish perspectives on the Great War, though I see here also on the list expert on Warsaw during the Great War, Professor Blobbaum, but there were not so many books that show specifically Jewish perspective, Eastern European Jewish perspective on this topic. There was, for example, recently published award-winning book by Jacqueline Granick, devoted to also JDC, and another also award-winning book published just last year and also award-winning book by Poliza Wadivker. But it seems to me that these are all the books and these are very recent publications. So it seems that the Great War has been still unexplored event, and its importance for the history of Eastern European Jewry has been underestimated. But I'm mentioning this because I think we should establish some of the facts. What are we talking about? Especially that here we have also non-academic audience, and I believe that Eastern Europe during the Great War is rather unfamiliar topic to Americans, also people from Western Europe or our Israeli audience. So let's establish first where was the Eastern Front and what is a home front. Let's look at the map. So here the map you can see Eastern Front with the marked with the lines. How is it moving from 1914 to 1918 during this war? And you see this was moving several times with Russian and German armies progressing and retreating. Millions of Eastern European Jews, Russian and Austrian subjects speaking German, Polish, Russian, and Yiddish were trapped between fighting Germans, Austrians, Russians, but also among their the ranks of Russian and Austrian army. There were Poles and the Jews themselves. I'm going to talk about this later. And we're going to look at the home front rather than the military front here. So by home front, we mean the civilian population, those who were not involved in fighting, those on the battlefield. We're going to talk about civilians. So these were mostly women, children, and elderly, those people who were in the cities, such as Rizla, Kami. And although the Great War dramatically reshaped the geopolitical map in the region, also determining the socio-legal status of Jews residing in Eastern Europe, the study of the home front allows for looking at different things and brings our attention to more economic and social aspects of this war rather than battles and politics. It allows us for seeing things that interest me at least more than the battles, such as reconfiguration of gender roles within families, communities, societies, changes in social mores, but also broader societal transformations. Let's now get to straight to the topic. What was happening with Jewish population during the war and how this affected Jewish women specifically. So from the beginning of the war, Jewish population witnessed massive displacement. A large proportion of Jews spent the war away from their homes. So out of 4 million Jews who lived in the war zone, at least 2 million Jews faced displacement. In early 1916, the estimated number of Jewish refugees was between 450 to 500,000 in the Russian Empire alone, and approximately another 200 to 300,000 Galician Jewish refugees. This was half of the Galician Jewish society, and so you understand the scope of the displacement. Galician Jewish refugees were dispersed mostly through the Austrian Empire. When the Russian army was progressing, they were escaping the Russian army in the pogroms that were accompanying it, and they went westward. Many of them reached Vienna and stayed there for the time of the war. Others were deported to the interior of Russia by the Russian army. Similarly, these deportations took place in the Pale of Settlement. You have this area of the Pale marked here. This is not the best map, but most of the maps from the period show it a bit not accurately, that the Kingdom of Poland is part of the Pale. It had different legal status, but it's not very important here. So also Jews who lived in the Pale of Settlement faced deportations, especially those who lived in the border areas. Jews were suspected of spying for the German army, so Russians were also deporting them and taking them to the interior of Russia, or expelling them from their places of residence. This happened especially, as I said, in the border areas, and many of these refugees, those who were not deported but expelled, they chose their destination. So many sought refuge in bigger cities. And as a consequence, Jewish communities in bigger cities swelled and dealt with new problems, such as massive masses of people applying for relief, massive unemployment, and massive homelessness. By 1915, only a year into the war, Warsaw, for example, became home to 75,000 Jewish refugees, and Vilnius of 12,000 Jewish refugees, but this number grew exponentially. Only by the following year, this number from 12,000 rose to 60,000 Jewish refugees. settling up in Vilnius, and we're gonna soon meet one of them. The Russian Jewish Relief Committee, this was another relief organization operating in the region beside JDC. This was actually more local organization that was set up to provide immediate help to displaced and hungry, assessed that around 2 million Jews suffered in one way or another from the war as early as 1915, a second year into this war. The massive influx of refugees exacerbated the economic hardships of those directly unaffected by displacement. And by this, I mean people who did not necessarily leave their homes. So, of course, not everybody had to leave. For example, there were still residents in Łódź, Lodz, or Warsaw and other cities. So many of them staying in the same place, but their hardships exacerbated due to the arrival of other of refugees displaced from other places. Now they had to receive multitudes of refugees from other localities, and these refugees were coming to the cities that already experienced many problems. The industry lie in ruins, trade almost halted, as I mentioned with the Rise Kamin story. It was very difficult to help these refugees. There was no work, and also there was scarcity of food, even before the arrival of refugees. And one might say that also non-Jews suffered during the war, and of course they did. But in many ways, Jews suffered at least proportionally to a greater extent. As I am trying to show here, the extent of the displacement was enormous. We see 50% of Jewish society displaced, affected by the war. This was certainly not happening to such a great extent with non-Jewish society. We don't see to such a great extent, for example, Poles being displaced. There, of course, some of them were also refugees, but not 50% of Polish non-Jewish society. Also, non-Jews were not concentrated so much in contracting urban economy, trade, commerce, and artisanry like Jews did. And these areas of the economy were very affected by the war negatively. All these branches of economy lie in ruin. Many of the non-Jewish families were actually majority of non-Jewish society in Eastern Europe were still farmers, and they were not they had direct access to food. They were not cut off from foodstuffs, like we're gonna see soon that was a problem in bigger cities, but also the countryside was not so much destroyed by military actions as much as the urban areas were. So let's talk more about the economy and how it affected Jewish population. So the economy of the Kingdom of Poland, the Pale of Settlement, and Galicia completely shattered during the Great War. The retreat of the Russian administration severed key economic links for the Kingdom of Poland, which relied on exports to the interior of Russia. Retreating, the Russians transported entire factories to the interior of Russia, sometimes even taking the stuff with them. So this was another aspect of deportations to the interior of Russia. And some of Jewish workers of the factories also were deported together with the retreating Russian army and Russian factories. Producers located in Poland who could continue production had no alternative export markets, as the Russians cut off their ties with the Kingdom of Poland. And this made their businesses also unprofitable and forcing them to shut down completely. So people lost jobs. Consumption slowed down as the majority of the population struggled to make ends meet. As the Jewish Relief Committee reported to its US headquarters, whole branches of trade have been shattered, barring the welfare of the artisans under the ruins. Tailors, weavers, bootmakers, builders, traders, normally sustaining a large percentage of Jews in Poland and the Pale, are dead. The artisans are left to starve. End of the quote. The German occupation further damaged the economy, as the Germans economically exploited the occupied territories, confiscating food, stores products, and artisans and factories' raw materials. Food stamps replaced money in the official market, and money exchange continued in the illegal food trade. Among the displaced who experienced this economic ruin and completely new realities under the German occupation was a well-known figure, at least in the scholarship, Rakowski, an educator, feminist, and Zionist activist. So as the Germans were progressing and getting closer to Warsaw, she escaped the city and ended up in Vilnius for many complicated reasons. I'm not going to get to this. She had to go to Vilnius for family reasons, and she stayed there for 2 years of the war. And Rakowski described how the German captured Vilnius in 1915. So she did not escape Russians capturing the city. She maybe escaped when they reached Warsaw, but they caught her in Vilnius. And she described how the economic situation of city residents changed with the German capture. She wrote in her Memoirs of Jewish Revolutionary. Necessary foodstuffs simply vanished overnight. The exorbitant prices for any food you can get rose by the hour. Instead of beef and veal, people started eating horse meat, she wrote. Bronia Baum, another Jewish woman living in the Kingdom of Poland during the war as a teenager, noted in her diary how the prices for essential products such as bread rose exponentially. The price of 6 pounds of bread jumped from 25 kopecks to 85 kopecks to reach 180 kopecks when the war ended. Let me do the calculations for you. The price was over 7 times higher by the end of the war. And here you have some pictures that reflect the difficult situation with getting food in war-torn Warsaw. Specifically, here on the left, you have a picture from the JDC archives. As the archival description says, these are Jews specifically standing in lines for bread in Warsaw around by the end of the war. And also here an example of food stamps for sugar, bread, and potatoes issued by Municipality of Warsaw around 1918 from Museum of Warsaw collections. So that's how people were able to buy these basic products. The majority of Jewish refugees looking for shelter and trying to survive were women and children, as many adult men were absent. The occupying forces recruited able-bodied Jews to perform unpaid labor away from home, separating them from their families. Raisa Kamin's neighbor, a resident in the same building in Pańska Street in Warsaw, Mrs. Tisman, complained to JDC office that her husband had been taken to Germany for labor and she had lost touch with him. She also asked the JDC for support and explained her situation. A quote, "My husband has now been 6 months in Germany and I have no news of him whatever. I'm living here in Warsaw with 3 children. My position is a very critical one, as I have no resources. I have sold everything I possessed in order to live. But now I'm at an end and I earn nothing. I have learned that you give relief and implore you hereby for relief or a loan so I can help myself." End of the quote. Much more numerous than those taken to Germany, like Mr. Tisman for forced labor, was a group of Jewish men who fought at the front as soldiers and also were separated from their families for an extended period of time. Around 300,000 Jewish men fought in the Austro-Hungarian forces, another from 350 to 600,000 Jews fought in the Russian army. The estimates for the Jews in the Russian army are very disparate. For me, it's also surprising that the various sources show such disparate numbers. And to be sure, other groups in the Kingdom of Poland, the Pale of Settlement, Galicia, were also liable for conscription. Of course, there were Poles serving in the Austro-Hungarian army, in the Russian army. But actually, the plight of Jewish families of conscripted soldiers could have been much more difficult, depending on an individual situation. Formally, the belligerent powers that recruited the local population in their army ranks supported the recruits' families by abolishing, for example, by abolishing rents, providing food and money. The Russian government, for example, allocated around 2 rubles monthly per family person of reservist soldiers conscripted into the army during the war, and also the Russian government provided monetary support to the families of recruited soldiers. Often these allowances were not sufficient to support the families on the home front, because as Bronia Baun was explaining in her diary, the prices rose exponentially. And today also we have a similar situation, that the prices, due to inflation, the prices of many products are higher, but the salaries are not growing accordingly. So similarly, during that war, the allowances were not adjusted to the growing prices during the skyrocketing prices during this war. And Jewish women were formally entitled to these allowances promised by the governments, but they were practically denied this state support because the state did not recognize many of them as lawful wives of conscripted men. So this was a little bit complicated issue, but let me explain you shortly how was it so. So before the war, all marriages performed in accordance with Jewish rituals had to be subsequently registered with the civil registers. Failure to report the union made them void in the eyes of the state, but still very much recognized within the Jewish communities and by the rabbis, and everything was kosher. We don't know how many of these marriages before the war were not registered properly. Many of the documents are lost. Also, there were not so many discussions about this until the war, when it became really a serious problem, because many families were left without these allowances. Now, the women who did not register their marriages before the war, as they should have with the civil registers, were not recognized as wives, and they could not receive the allowances as wives of the soldiers from the state. And the fear of not receiving state support encouraged many to register their marriages post factum in the first weeks of the war. And for example, Odessan rabbinate in the first weeks of the war recorded 1,500 marriages that entered civil registers. We can assume that most of them were those post factum registrations, not simply new marriages. And in the following months and years of the war, recognizing really a big scale of the problem and the difficult situation of many Jewish families, Jewish communal councils in various cities sought to alleviate the situation of Jewish reservist wives, called rezervistkes. For some time, some of these councils provided allowances for women who did not qualify for municipal support, when they were not recognized by the state as wives, but the Jewish community recognized them as lawful wives of these men. And one of these reservist wives, a reservistka, applying for the Jewish Community Council support was Rivka Redkinska, who also, like Raisla Kamień we started with, used the help of legal counselor to write her petition to receive monetary support. Here is her petition to the Łódź Jewish Community Council, submitted in 1916. She writes, "For 3 years now, my husband has been in the army and I'm left with 2 children, 5 and 3 years old, without any means. Until now, my parents supported us, but given their current tragic situation, they cannot help me anymore. Therefore, I turn to you, Jewish Community Council in Łódź, to give me a reservist soldier wife's allowance." End of the quote. Probably she was not eligible to this state allowances that I told you about, because her marriage was not in the civil registrar's books. We don't know if she received the allowances from the community. Similarly to the other petitions that were submitted to the JDC, not in the same files, we cannot tell if the petition was answered positively. what is certain, many women, those reservist wives, remained without any means. There were many discussions in the press about their plight, and I will shortly also explore and show you how other Jewish women navigated this difficulty in receiving allowances, besides resorting to their Jewish communities. But let me tell you first about one more reason why Jewish families experienced male absence to a greater extent than non-Jewish society. There was a substantial group of women whose husbands or fathers had been absent since before the war that even started. So not only those who were deported during the war or drafted to the army, but their absence already started earlier. But due to the war, the consequences of this absence became very tangible. Thousands of Jewish men from Eastern Europe had immigrated overseas in the last pre-war decades and hoped to bring their families over after settling in. But due to the war, their reunification had to wait, as migration virtually halted for the time of the war. Recently, a scholar of Jewish migration, Gur Al-Roi, actually challenged this idea. There was no Jewish migration to the US during this period. Actually, he discovered that instead of going through Western Europe, Jews from the Russian Empire were going through the Russian Empire to the east and reaching the shores of the US from the west, and not from the eastern shores. But we're talking still about very small numbers compared to the Jewish mass migration from Eastern Europe to the US from the pre-war period that peaked actually in these years that preceded World War I. So when the war started, the families were very anxious about how long it's gonna take. And they were afraid that they won't be able to join their husbands and fathers for a long time. And actually, press reported in the first 2 weeks of the war about an attempt of over 200 Jewish women with children from the Russian Empire who tried to immigrate to the US to join their husbands and avoid being stuck in Eastern Europe. As they expected obstacles to come later during the war, but unfortunately, they were returned home from Western Europe. And while it's impossible to estimate how many families were stranded in Eastern Europe because of war, we see that right after the war, there was unprecedented proportion of Jewish men and women and children immigrated from Eastern Europe to the US in the first 4 years, right before the quotas, restrictive quotas. And around 60% of immigrants were women. And scholars speculate that this was the accumulation of these women and children who were not able to join their fathers and husbands for the 4 years of the war. And one of these stranded wives in Eastern Europe was mother of Lilian Gorenstein, a Jewish woman who wrote a memoir of her childhood during the Great War in the Pale of Settlement. Her memoir from the period of 1914 to 1924, written in 1989, when she was quite an elderly woman, was published in Evo Annual in 1991. And Gorenstein's father immigrated to the US shortly before the war started and was about to bring the rest of the family, but the war interrupted their plans. Women like Gorenstein's mother were stuck in war-torn Europe and cut off from remittances. They did not necessarily wait passively for these remittances to come. It took a little while. So in 1915, the Joint Distribution Committee opened a transmission department to deliver personal remittances from American Jews to their Eastern European relatives. And here you have a photograph also from JDC archives showing this office, JDC office, Department of Remittances in Warsaw. This is 2 years after it opened, with lines of Eastern European Jews waiting to receive their remittances. So before the remittance started to come, some women tried to find a way how to sustain themselves without this money that used to come probably regularly before the war. So, for example, Gorenstein's mother opened up a tea shop that catered to passing German soldiers. They actually lived next to the border. So she describes in her memoir many German soldiers passing and stopping by. Also, her other female relatives in this town sold cigarettes, also mainly to German soldiers. And once the JDC opened its offices, remittances started to come in 1915, and here on the right, you see excerpt from very long lists of remittances recipients through JDC. These are recipients in Eastern Europe. You can see here mostly Kingdom of Poland, so Piotrków Gubernia, Łomża Gubernia, Siedlce, and these are women. So on the list, of course, are not only women. I actually caught a page where mostly women, but not to mislead you, there are not only women there. Who were receiving these remittances in Eastern Europe. And when the JDC resumed the flow of money from the US, actually many women started to reach out to their even long forgotten relatives who were in the US, informing them about their difficult situation in Eastern Europe. I found cases about women who were informing their family that they had lost touch with, that the husband died, so she has no money. She's updating them that now she's a widow and she needs some money from her family. She doesn't know how to reach them. So please send money through the JDC. Here are some other examples of Jewish women calling their relatives through Yiddish press to send money to Eastern Europe. That was, however, the situation of those who had relatives in the US. Those who had relatives, for example, in Latin America, were less lucky. The remittances were not arriving from other places because JDC offered this service between the US and Eastern Europe. So as Jewish men were drafted to the military, forced to perform unpaid labor away from home, were deported to the interior of Russia, or could not send remittances from abroad, Jewish women had to take on the burden of breadwinning. So those who remained in their hometowns or resided elsewhere as refugees were forced to look for sources of sustenance for themselves and their children. And as you see in the very same petition of Bryce Lacami, where she turned to charity, she writes about her attempts to make money before she turned to charity. She hawked fruits. We know from other sources that many women peddled, also illegally. They did not hold trading permits. They risked arrest. Women like Lilian Gorenstein's mother opened hospitality venues, tea shops, cafes, restaurants, many catering to military staff because they were in a better position than local civilian population. Others worked as washer, waitresses, or actresses in emerging entertainment industry. So German occupation was very devastating for the economy, but the occupiers had very liberal cultural policies, and we see flourishing cultural life. And this boom of cultural life was very well documented in Vilnius, that German captured in 1915, something that Kourakowski described. And we see Jewish traders and artisans who lost their livelihood opening beer halls, opening other entertainment or hospitality venues. We have Yiddish theater, and many of these places, including Yiddish theater, being open on Saturdays. And this is a very new development. Scholars are writing about secularizing processes that are taking place during the war. Also, we see these processes taking place among Jewish women. So also Jewish women are engaging with this entertainment industry. They work on Saturday. And also we read about Jewish women taking up jobs that they would not have done before the war because they were not so respectable, such as actresses or prostitutes, which I'm going to talk about this in a second. We also read news about Jewish women giving up on kosher food because it was too expensive or very hard to find. As I said, there was the access to food was not easy during the war, and some women, as they were responsible for providing food for their families, they just gave up on keeping kashrut, and also Saturday, if they had to work, that was the only job available, so they also worked on Saturdays. So let me discuss one last aspect, because my time is almost over. So prostitution, which also relates to my previous research. So during the war, also some Jewish women engaged in the sex industry, and they did so in two ways. As organizers and as workers of brothels. So besides running tea shops, taverns, restaurants, dance halls, Jewish women also open up brothels, often turning their own apartments into clandestine prostitution venues. In early 1918, 30-year-old Jewish woman Rosalia Haskielewicz stood trial in Łódź for renting room to sex workers in German-occupied city. Prostitution and brothels were not illegal per se. So here you see German administration's announcement about the regulation of prostitution, here specifically in German-occupied Vilnius, but they did similar regulations of prostitution in all of the cities that they occupied during the war, so Warsaw, Łódź, and this was not very different from pre-war regulation of prostitution, that prostitution was tolerated as long as it was registered. So here is an announcement about women who should register and also go through medical checkups for venereal diseases. And as you see, this was for Vilnius specifically. This is very interesting. This is in 4 languages. In German, from the left, German, Polish, Lithuanian, and Yiddish, which shows you the extent how big was the Jewish population in Vilnius at that time. Just to remind you, there were 60,000 Jewish refugees in Vilnius at that time, in addition to the local Jewish community. So prostitution flourished as during every war, and there was a big demand among soldiers, but also the difficult economic conditions encouraged women to take up sex work to survive. Actually, there are some statistics about prostitution from this period. They tell us something, but not everything. They're very tricky. So the registration office in German-occupied Warsaw recorded that 60% of women sold sex because of the difficult conditions during the war. So we see that war was the main reason why they took up prostitution. It means also that they did not practice prostitution before the war. Over 21% of registered prostitutes were classified as war widows. So similarly to Rijsla Kamień, they lost their husbands during the war, and they need to sustain themselves, so they turned to prostitution. Also, again, for the first time in their lives. Around 23%, so over 600 sex workers were married. So because I studied prostitution in Warsaw, or in general in Eastern Europe, before and after the Great War, this was an enormous, this was exceptional. Married women never constituted such a big percentage of registered sex workers. Usually it was very small percentage. Here 23% shows you how big was the problem to survive the war without male wage earners. When women were married, burdened with families, they had to turn to prostitution. much more than they did so before the war or after the war. So this was very exceptional. And while we know that 24% of all sex workers registered in Warsaw were Jewish, the statistics don't tell us how many Jewish women were in each of this group. But also they tell us that 23% were out of half of the 23% married prostitutes were the reservist soldiers' wives. And as I told you, the problem of the allowances concerned mostly Jewish women. So we can speculate that a large proportion of these reservist soldiers' wives were Jewish because they could not receive state support. And actually, we have one story of such a woman, also another criminal case from Łódź. In 1917, newspapers reported that a Jewish woman in German-occupied Łódź, Rivka A, stood trial accused of engaging in prostitution without being legally registered. Rivka A was a Jewish married woman, and the news says that she was an army reservist's wife, a rezerwistka, and one day she approached two Jewish men, Traub and Meyerowicz, on the streets and told them that she missed her husband who went to war, the press reported. Then she invited them to her apartment. They followed her home, and after sexual intercourse, the needy wife demanded a ruble from each of them, but they gave her 50 kopecks, which is half of ruble each. After that, they both visited Rivka from time to time. Here we have such a reservist wives, and she did it illegally. Here we have statistics for those who did it legally in Warsaw. Half of registered married sex workers were reservist wives like Rivka. We can speculate that many did it illegally. We also know that if a reservist wife was selling sex, she lost her when she was registered, she lost her allowances because it was considered work. Just to, because my time is ending, just to summarize, Rivka as Raisla Cummings, Mrs. Tisman, Rivka Riftinska, and Lilian Gorenstein's mother's stories reflect and show us various strategies taken by Jewish women to survive this catastrophic war. Their experiences during the war were gendered. As women, many married and burdened with children, they made up the majority of civilian population on the Eastern home front. Many of them lost their male wage earners who, for various reasons, were absent from their household. And now many of them, some had to earn money for their family, and maybe certainly for the first time, they were the only breadwinners of their family, and they had to strategize how to get food that was scarce and very expensive. So the conditions that they suddenly started to make money for the family were very difficult. They were not regular circumstances. It was very very hard for them as women and as Jews to find a job and to survive this difficult war. And this limited range of options to make a living was mitigated to some extent by Jewish community councils that open up new relief organizations, expanded welfare by local committees such as this Russian Jewish community, but also foreign Jewish committees such as Joint Distribution Committee. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Alexandra, for fascinating lecture. And we now open the floor to questions. Please remember that your microphones are muted, and send us your question via the Q&A function. And I see that we already have a few questions, and I will start asking them to you, Alexandra. I'm trying to think of a certain order. What is the reason for the reluctance of Jewish marriages to be registered with civil society? Was it the cost?
Yes. So there was a big discrepancy between how Jewish Jewish marriages were performed and the expectations of the civil authorities. So, for example, when the Christians had marriages, they automatically were registered because the priests had this power, but the rabbis did not. They had to go together with the rabbi. Also, that the rabbis did not have to be present. Jewish marriages did not require the presence of a rabbi. So the civil authorities did not take this under consideration, that there is no necessity for presence of any official in a Jewish wedding. So the rabbi had to go, the spouses, and also two witnesses. There was a cost of this. And this was very expensive, and we see many petitions during the war and also right after the war by Jewish men and women asking to register their marriages without this cost. And the Jewish community was actually covering, this was in Łódź, it was covering this cost of registration because they understood there are very serious consequences of failure to register Jewish marriages. Also, I read that there was a custom of Jewish marriages to be performed in Eastern Europe, at least. I don't know how is it today, in the evening. And the offices were already closed. So when everybody finished with the ceremony, they could not register immediately after the ceremony because the offices were closed, and people did not bother to go another day with all the people involved. As I said, the rabbi, the spouses, and the two witnesses, to go another day to the civil registrar. So there were many practical reasons, but I believe the cost was the main reason for this failure to register the marriages.
I think I've read somewhere that a number of Jewish children didn't have their father's names because the marriage were not registered, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And they had their mother's name, and then that led to a number of complications as well. Okay, we have a number. We have a number of questions now. So why were Jews more likely to go to urban center?
Well, they believed that it would be easier to survive in an urban center where they hope to get a job there. But also they hoped to rely on a welfare system of organized Jewish communities. And they hope that in these places, Jewish communities are still operating. So, for example, in Galicia, in many small shtetls, Jewish communities stopped operating. There were no Jewish community councils, the rabbis left, so there was no leadership even left in the small shtetls. So in the big cities, they still operated quite well. There was a welfare system, and there were these organizations such as JDC opened up their offices. So I assume because of these reasons, they believe that it would be easier to get help from bigger Jewish communities.
Thank you. I see that we have a few questions about the requests themselves that women send. So I will try to group those questions. Did you find many written requests from women like the few you showed during the presentation during the war? We know how many Jewish women made these requests. And the second somewhat related question is, I would like to know more about what kind of relief women ask from the JDC, judging from petitions like the one you cited. Did women seem to prefer one-time loans or monthly sums? Did they ask for additional ration stamps? Did they ever ask for material aid like raw material for sewing or other crafts, machines for artisanal production?
Well, so I didn't find many petitions because the materials are scarce. We also don't have the list. I wish we had the list of all the petitions received, and we can have some statistics. Unfortunately, there are no such statistics. At least I haven't seen in the archives. So these are just fragments that I found. This is fragmentary data. I believe there are many more petitions to go through in the Jewish community of Łódź, because there are thousands of petitions. They have really many petitions, not only by Jewish women, but also men. Women are usually asking for monetary support. I noticed that men are more asking for raw materials or loans to open up a business. And we see also in Eastern Europe during this war that many organizations try to help Jewish population by giving them materials and also machines so they can sustain themselves. Also, we have organizations offering training to women, vocational training. So Sarah Zaro gave a lecture about Klaftenova, so she already started to do that during the war. We see that they recognize the difficult situation of Jewish women, and they want to alleviate also through training, not only by giving monetary support or materials.
Thank you. Yes, Sarah Zaro gave a few months ago a lecture on Cecilia Kriptanova, and it is recorded and on the JDC Archives website if anyone is interested in seeing it. Were there any Jewish women philanthropic organizations that help Jewish women? That's somewhat what.
So besides those, so in Galicia, women were the most organized. Jewish women there, we have women who become the elite of social work in interwar Poland, such as Cecilia Klaftenova, Róża Melcerowa, Ada Richtenstein. So they are already operating during the war in Galicia. But surprisingly, I haven't seen any efforts by Jewish women elsewhere, at least in the Kingdom of Poland. Perhaps in the new book by Polly Zawadiwker, who wrote about Russian Jewish refugees, maybe she discovered some efforts by more Russian Jewish women. So maybe Jewish elites from St. Petersburg, they did something. They already did many. They set up philanthropic organizations before the war. Also, I know from my previous research that there were Jewish Association for the Protection of Women. They also functioned during the war. They were established, many of them before the war, but they also continued working during the war. And I assume I didn't see many materials produced by them during the war, but and they worked certainly in Lviv, in Krakow, in Warsaw, in Łódź, and certainly if they operated, they also helped women with the monetary relief, maybe even giving loans, giving machines for sewing, as they did before the war.
Okay, now we're getting into some more questions. So question for you. One is, could you estimate the scale of unregistered prostitution during the war, given the number of disincentives for women to register? And second, could you speak to how American entrance into the war in April 1917 affected Jews who earlier benefited from support coming from the JDC?
So regarding prostitution, it's impossible to estimate illegal prostitution. Even the estimates of legal prostitutions are not available so much. And also, it's hard to say what was considered, like to what extent registered prostitution, what we have in files, really reflects what is registered. If women were enrolled into registries of prostitution because they were caught on, I don't know, selling sex to a neighbor once, or they were really doing this as sex workers. But we see a boom in prostitution, even registered one. in Vilnius, in Lviv, also Łódź and Warsaw. We hear there are not so many statistics. This one for Warsaw is quite exceptional one. Usually these are just comments about with some numbers. So we hear about 1,000 prostitutes in Lviv, whereas before the war, when we compare, we talk mostly about, I don't know, 200 registered. So we see that prostitution, registered one, is 5 times bigger during the war. And it's hard to say, for example, Germans, because there was a military occupation, if they maybe took care of the registration more carefully than the Russians and the Austrians before the war. Though the regulation was the same, but maybe because it was military occupation, the soldiers were more, the military staff was more concerned about the spread of venereal disease during the war. So they really tracked women who sold sex and then enrolled them. So it's hard for me to say why the numbers, even of registered women, grew exponentially. To what extent, how many women stayed in the shadow, so still not registered.
I will ask you one more question. Have information if the woman who became on whether the woman who became prostitutes during World War I stopped or continued after the war?
So unfortunately, we don't have sources that allow us for tracking women for such a long period, because it's actually it's a long period, and we don't have registries with the names that cover both the war and after the war. Actually, there is only one registry for interwar period, and it's from Vilnius, and it starts only in the late 1920s. But we have some statistics give us an impression that actually some married women continued working as sex workers after the war, because the situation was very difficult. The men were still absent, and the economy did not favor women so much. So we still see quite high percentage of married, also Jewish women among registered sex workers in Poland, much bigger than it was before the war. So to some extent, the conditions are similar, but it's hard to say to what extent these women started during the war, and if it's a continuation or maybe a new set of women. And that's the main problem with studying prostitution. We don't have individual women that we can track.
And did you encounter in your research anything about the reaction of the Jewish community towards those women who had become who were prostitutes?
Yes, there was a lot of criticism already during the war, but even historians writing about the Great War in the interwar period are writing about a spread of immorality among Jewish women. So this would probably be prostitution and maybe some other behaviors that they do not specify, but also we have many many sources note prostitution. They don't explore it in further detail, but they note and complain that there is immorality among Jewish women.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. This was so interesting. And thank you to our participants for joining us today. The lecture was recorded. It will be available on our website in about 2 weeks. I also want to thank Sorel Tessin for endowing this fellowship and for introducing Alexandra. And I want to thank the Miriam Mimi Pasternak Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC archives, who makes those webinars possible. Our next program will take place on March 12th. Shirley Gilbert, a recipient of the 2024 Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship, will give a lecture on finding Jewish refugees in Africa, reflections from the JDC Archives. Invitations will be sent out next week, and you will also be able to register via our website. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you want to receive invitations to our future public programs. Thank you, everyone.